Hi, everybody. I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes to get in from the waiting room, and I will get the closed captions going. Hopefully everything cooperates with us today. All right, the closed caption should be up now. You'll see a red box on your screen, and you can click on that to see the closed captions. And I'm also going to put it in the chat in case anyone can't access it on the screen. Well, welcome everyone and happy Friday. I'm Christy Baglow, the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. And I'm so glad there's so much interest in this topic and that you could all join us today. It's kind of a heavy topic. Today we'll be talking about legal advocacy, rebuilding a life after childhood trafficking. I'm so thankful to Professor Annino of FSU College of Law for reaching out to me and offering to do this topic. Professor Annino is the director of the Public Interest Law Center and the Children's Advocacy Clinic at FSU Law School. And with him today are his students, Daynica Harley, Melody Andrews, and Gigi Green. And I was just telling them before we started the webinar, I am just in awe of them for tackling this during law school. As all of you on this know, law school is hard enough without adding childhood trafficking to it. So I am just so impressed that they're doing this on top of law school and that Professor Annino is doing a great job inspiring the next generation of public interest attorneys. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the team.
Thank you, Christy, and I'm really happy to be here today. I welcome all my friends out there in the audience. We're talking about trafficking of children. One of the things I direct is the HELP project. That's the Human Trafficking Exploitation Law Project. And in that project, what we do is represent individual children in our community, primarily North Florida. We do law reform work, and we also do research. But before I talk about this topic area, I want to do a shout out to one of my former students, Daniela Donoso. Daniela, about 3 years ago, came up to me at the law school and said, hey, we need a human trafficking clinic. And so the law school responded to Daniela, and that's what was the start of our HELP project. So I want to thank her for that. So to begin, who are trafficked children? Well, the main concept, the master concept, the way I like to phrase it, is exploitation. So who are the trafficked children? They're exploited children. And how are they exploited? There's two different ways. They're exploited by because of sex, so they're sex trafficked children, exploited because of labor, so they're labor trafficked children. Who exploits them? The traffickers. And why do the traffickers exploit these children? Either for labor or for sex. Why do they do it? They do it for gain. Now, it could be economic gain, it could be trade of drugs, it could be a lot of other interactions, but in most cases, it's for financial gain. That's why. So if we could go to the next slide. And right here, very good. And so when we talk about sex trafficking, especially, we really have this dynamic of trafficker, child, and buyer. Now, some folks out there think, oh, these traffickers are from Romania or Bulgaria, and these trafficked kids are from someplace in Russia. Well, no. In the United States, the majority of kids who are trafficked are local children. Children in Tallahassee, children in Miami, children in Orlando, children in Tampa. And they're local children who are being trafficked. And they're being trafficked not by international cartels, Pablo Escobar or whatever. No, they're being trafficked by local people, okay? And the buyers are local people. So one of the key things I want to say, though, on this triad here that trafficked children are treated as commodities. They're treated as chattel. They're property that the trafficker sells to the buyer. And that's really is the heart of sex trafficking, is the sense of this economic activity that's happening. And to disrupt this economic activity, one of the things we're going to talk about today is the child and working in with vulnerability. So if we could go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So yes. So how many trafficked children in Florida? There's no good data on this. It's a shame, but there is no good data on this. The data we have is pretty much what I have here, is that the Department of Children and Family Services, they use their foster care dependency hotline for trafficked children. And so in 2019, that's the last complete year of data we have, there were 3,088 calls into the Department of Children and Family Services hotline to report trafficked children. So 3,088. Of that 3,088, they really have to go through a gauntlet, these kids, in order to be verified. And so Department of Children and Family Services only verified 378 of the 3,088 hotline calls. And by the way, the majority of those calls to the hotline are from law enforcement, either Department of Juvenile Justice or sheriffs or police departments. So they're not just bogus calls. So we know that in Florida, the actual number of trafficked children for sex or labor is way, way, way underreported. If we compare Florida with Texas, and that's not a bad comparison because we're the third largest state in the union, 20.2 million people. Texas is the second largest state, okay? Second largest state in the union. So in a major study done in Texas, University of Texas at Austin, the social scientists estimated that in Texas, there were approximately 79,000 children being trafficked. So, which is it? Somewhere between 378 and 79,000, right? So one thing we do know that our numbers are definitely low, okay? And being underreported. The significance of it being underreported then is that we're not getting the funding that we need to deal with this problem because we're not really documenting the pervasiveness of trafficking of children in Florida. Okay. Another comment I want to make is that DCF children, in Florida, we do this. We have a divide. We say there's DCF children who are trafficked and non-DCF children who are trafficked. So there's two groups. We have DCF children who are trafficked and non-DCF children who are trafficked. The DCF children who are trafficked are children who are under the legal supervision of the Department of Children and Family Services. And that's approximately 35% of the verified trafficked children. So approximately 35% of the verified trafficked children are under the legal supervision of the Department of Children and Family Services. 64%, so the majority are not in DCF supervision, they're in the community. Now, what's often not mentioned is, yes, they're in the community, but this community children often have contact with Department of Juvenile Justice. They also have contact with children in need of services, SINFIN as we used to call it, children in need of services. And based on my experience, at least many of these community children that I encounter who are trafficked really should be with the DCF children because they've been abused, neglected, and abandoned. Okay, and next slide, please. What do all these children have? They have vulnerability, vulnerability, vulnerability. That's the common denominator of all trafficked children. Now, there is no iconic trafficked child. There is not. Professor Terry Kunin at the Center for Human Rights really makes that point very well. There is no iconic survivor of human trafficking. Why isn't there any iconic survivor? Because the vulnerabilities are all different. So you have a child who's vulnerable because of years of sexual abuse. You have a child that's vulnerable because of years of physical abuse. The child, like I'm thinking of one child right now who was whipped repeatedly. Then you have child who are homeless. You have child with cognitive deficits, child who are psychiatric with psychiatric deficits, emotional deficits, and then you have children with a combination of all these vulnerabilities. But the key concept, though, is vulnerability. So if you want to end human trafficking, we need to mitigate and reduce vulnerable children in our community. Right? And that's what's so important for Department of Children and Family Services, guardian ad litem programs, all Agency for Healthcare Administration, all our state agencies. If we want to eliminate this triad, this trafficked practice we have in Florida, we have to reduce vulnerability. Okay, next one, please. Well, my next speaker, Daynica Harley, will talk about compound trauma, so I'll pass that right now. But I do want to talk about sexual abuse. So if there's only one takeaway from this talk today, at least with my part of the talk, I hope the takeaway is that sexual abuse is the gateway trauma. Sexual abuse is the strongest predictor that children are going to be trafficked. And there's a major study done by really these incredible social scientists here in Florida. The study is called Human Trafficking of Minors and Childhood Adversity in Florida. They really clearly stated, and really their conclusion is that of all the different types of traumas, it is sexual abuse is the strongest predictor. And it's something unique about sexual abuse as a trauma. It's a gateway trauma. It opens up the receptivity to drug addiction and other forms of trauma. On another topic, but still in the same thing of flags, red flags. So one big red flag that I hope you'll take away is sexual abuse as a sign. Another big red flag, and I don't have time to tell my stories on this, is chronic running away. You know, you have these kids who run away. You know, this isn't Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer type stuff. They're running away, at least for Tom Sawyer, they're running away because of sexual and physical abuse. And again, 80%, one study showed 80% of all chronic runaway kids are sexually and physically abused. Again, that is a sign. Running away is also a sign, a risk factor for determining which children are going to be vulnerable to being trafficked. Now I want to step back a little bit, and talk about the Department of Children and Family Services for a minute. So right now, the Department of Children and Family Services, you know, they take care of abused, neglected, and abandoned children, right? That's what they do. And then you have these incredible folks who work for DCF and the guardian ad litem program and the training ad litems who are out there every day helping abused, neglected, and abandoned children. And how many children does the whole Department of Children and Family Service handle? Approximately today, I'm talking about today, about 21,000 kids. Okay, about 21,000 kids. Of the 21,000 kids that are in the foster care system, we know, again, as of today, that almost 1,000 of the children were placed in DCF's custody because of abuse, and we know exactly what kind of abuse, and that is sexual abuse. That should be a red flag for DCF attorneys, guardian ad litems, attorney ad litems, and for judges, by the way, too. Judges have a responsibility here as a hybrid court of equity to make sure that this population gets special care. Can we have the next slide, please? And what is that special care? Intensive trauma therapy. That's it. All the stakeholders in that courtroom, in the dependency courtroom, really need to focus on making sure that the case plans address intensive trauma therapy. So that's my main takeaway for my talk. I want to introduce you to a short video of a survivor of human trafficking. And this is Carly Church, and this is a TED Talk she did, and I think is very powerful.
Sorry, having a bit of technical issues. Hold on one second, please.
Okay. I think so.
I want to touch on why it's not as simple as asking somebody to leave, because it is horrific. Just because you believe somebody loves you doesn't mean you don't have to do things that you never thought you would do before. You have absolutely no control. So I can tell you from my experience, my traffickers had taken all control from me. I hated every minute of it. I had no idea who was coming to my hotel room door, and I had no idea what service I was expected to provide. I hated every minute of it. It was the most traumatic and horrific experience of my life, but as crazy as it sounds, my life was still better than before I had met them. I had a roof over my head, I had food in my stomach, I wasn't withdrawing on the streets in the freezing cold. I would have done whatever it took to keep it there, and I would have never walked out of that hotel room door. Physically, I could have. I was not locked up, I was not tied in a room, my pimps were not there 24/7. Physically, I could have opened my hotel room door, I could have walked out, and I could have asked for help. I never would have. There are 3 reasons why I wouldn't have left, and after working with young people for quite a few years now in similar situations, these are the 3 reasons why people don't just leave. The first is the obvious, the fear. I was afraid of them. There was some physical violence in my situation, and all I could think is, if I walk out this door, what are they going to do to me? That fear was real. More so than that, though, it was the fear of the unknown. If I walk out this door, where am I going to go? Where am I going to get my next meal? Where am I going to sleep tonight? Where am I going to get my next fix? And who is ever going to love me again after this? Who is ever going to take care of me? That was much scarier than they were. And the final reason I didn't leave was the psychological hold that they had on me, the trauma bond. It is unbelievable how strong that is. They picked me up off the ground when everybody else had given up on me. They were there for me when nobody else was. They treated me better than anybody had ever treated me before. The best way I can really explain that trauma bond is I'll tell you a very short story. It happened to me after I took my very first trick. One of my pimps came in the room and he sat down on the bed beside me and he looked at me in the eyes, and it was so genuine. Every time I tell this story, I can in fact still picture the moment, and it still feels just as genuine. Logically, I know it's not, but that's how strong it was in the moment. He sat there and he looked at me in the eyes and he said, "Carly, I am so proud of you." And he said it because I told him way back in the luring stage that the only thing I had ever wanted to hear growing up is that somebody was proud of me. Now he said it. Didn't matter anymore who was proud of me or what they were proud of me for. Somebody was finally proud of me. I was finally good at something. I was going to do whatever it took to hear that over and over and over again. This is what human trafficking looks like. So really quickly, just to end, what can everybody do today? Starting today, how can we
That's real powerful video by Carly Church. And I think one of the main points it brings across is trauma, and how trauma led the way to trafficking. And now I'm going to turn to Daynica Harley, third-year law student who is the president of the Black Student Association at FSU, and also has a certificate on trauma from FSU School of Social Work. Daynica?
Thank you, Professor Annino. As Professor Annino mentioned, it is critical that we discuss trauma while we're talking about trafficking. Today, I'll be talking about trauma, trauma-informed advocacy, and also the impact of those trauma bonds that Ms. Church referred to in her video. We understand that trafficking by definition involves force, fraud, and coercion. That's only magnified when the trafficking involves a minor child. In light of the trauma experienced as a result of childhood trafficking, it's important that we as advocates are informed of the manifestations of trauma and the best practices for advocacy. We could look at trauma as being divided into 3 categories, if you will, knowing that there's short-term trauma, long-term trauma, and the complex trauma, which often looks like PTSD. Okay. Now, there is no right way to process trauma, nor is there only one way to manifest that trauma. In working with clients that have experienced a severe amount of trauma, we may see reactions and responses across a variety of areas, whether that's in terms of their behavior, in terms of their physicality, and their physiological responses, their mental, or also emotional responses. We see there's a whole range of things we could come to expect and anticipate, but at the end of the day, we know there is no one-size-fits-all experience of trauma. Okay? Listed, I've included some of the common short-term responses to trauma that we may be familiar with. As you see, this list reflects both psychological and physiological responses that take place. We know that these reactions to trauma are things that are often prevalent, but could easily be overlooked if an advocate does not have the proper training or the desire to see what's lying underneath the surface of your interactions. Okay. I've included this next image to help us put a framework to understanding what long-term trauma looks like. This image is a picture from a paper that was published by the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2014. On the left, you'll see depicted the scanning of a healthy brain. You'll see the functioning of that brain, particularly in the temporal lobe, as reflected in the red-orange activity in that part of the brain. On the right, however, we see the brain of a child who was abused at an early age. This child was a Romanian orphan who had experienced a great deal of trauma. And you notice in that same temporal lobe, the area of the brain that regulates emotion and receives input from senses, you'll see a much less activity than that of the healthy brain. I'd also like to point out the amygdala, which is if you notice at the bottom of the image. You'll see there's a great deal of activity in the abused brain. The amygdala is responsible for triggering our hypothalamus, which releases the stress hormone. When we talk about stress reaction in dangerous situations, typically we're familiar with fight and flight response. When trauma is brought into that equation, however, we see a third response evolve, and that response is a freeze response. Oftentimes, in order to cope with the situations that they've experienced or dealt with, we see clients experiencing that freeze. It's practically a paralysis and a coping mechanism in which they disassociate from their surroundings as well as their experiences. Okay. As Professor Annino alluded, we know that trauma, especially in trafficking clients, that it occurs not only before those incidents of trafficking, but also during and after. As professionals, we need to be aware that really these experiences of trauma have a compounding effect, where we find that many of our child trafficking victims are experiencing a complex trauma. And the way that demonstrates, it's often very similar to symptoms and experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder. These have a very complex interaction and impact on not only neurological functioning, behavior, relationship forming, and so many other key aspects of our client's experience. And so it's important that we as advocates are aware and mindful of how this trauma impacts their experience. Okay. Listed, I've included some of the features of complex trauma. As I mentioned before, this is not a standardized experience. There's no linear experience of trauma where you may see one client experience progress and an ability to understand and make meaning of their experience. You may also see regression in some areas. Complex trauma is so multifaceted and so diverse in its manifestation that there is truly no way to predict how a particular client will respond. The best thing that we can do as advocates is learn how to recognize that trauma and do our best to help our clients feel comfortable again. Okay. As I've been discussing today, navigating our client responses is difficult and it should not be taken personally. I know I've had a client experience where a client called me in tears, frustrated about her situation, and in a way, angry with me because I couldn't do anything to help her or to change the situation. In that moment, I had to take myself out of that situation and realize it wasn't anything personal, and that at the end of the day, it has much more to do with their experience of trauma and the things and the people who have impacted them. And so some examples of these coping mechanisms that we can learn to expect. We can learn to expect disengagement with the legal process, fear of authority, a need for family, community, and even financial support, as well as a feeling of being overwhelmed, powerless to change, or even avoidance. As Professor Annino mentioned earlier, we may also see maladaptive coping in the form of substance abuse or alcohol abuse. Okay. As advocates, it is critical that we approach our role from the goal and the mindset to be victim-centered in everything we do. We can learn a lesson from the medical field, and we can make it our goal, first and foremost, to do no harm to our clients by re-traumatizing them. While yes, it is important we get the story and understand their narrative, that should not be at the expense of their well-being and their mental health. Maxine Harris describes trauma-informed service systems as systems whose primary mission is altered by the virtue of knowledge about trauma and the impact it has on the lives of consumers receiving those services. And I think that's very critical for our understanding, that we look at these three pillars. We understand that they shape the way we approach conversations, they shape the way we interact with our clients, because we're trying to recognize the signs, we're trying to re-traumatize our clients, and most importantly, we seek this as an opportunity to empower them to move forward. Okay. So with that being said, I want to talk about some strategies that you can apply to your work and to your advocacy. Number one, I want to emphasize communication is key, whether that's verbal communication or nonverbal communication. There is so much that we express that we need to be mindful of when we're not only speaking and relating to our client, but also how we're telling them about what's going on in their case. First, starting with the introduction. There are so many people in the legal system, and I know for myself as a law student, it can be easy to mistake roles and identities when you met so many people involved in the process. That's why it's so important, especially when you're working with a child who has experienced trafficking, that you explain your role in a way that is easy for them to understand. You explain that you are there for them and that your purpose as a legal advocate is to help them through this process. You want to make sure you're addressing the safety and security needs. Those are first and foremost. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all know that those basic needs need to be met before you can address the higher level things. As an advocate, you need to be patient. I said before, this is not a linear process, and so you can't expect to just rush through and achieve an end goal. You also want to anticipate a lack of trust, particularly if you're establishing a new relationship. A lot of times, those walls have been built up for protection. Those walls have been built up as a coping mechanism. And so you need to demonstrate that you are a trustworthy individual, that you are someone who they can trust. One way I found that works and that helps me in establishing that trust is to not make promises as I'm talking to my clients about their case. I know not to make promises because I know just how detrimental it would be for another person in their life to break a promise made to them. Okay? And thinking back and referencing Ms. Church's videos about specifically her point on the trauma bond that was formed with her traffickers. We know those bonds, it's a psychological hold that's taken place between the trafficker and the survivor. That's why it's so critical as an advocate, you work to establish that trust. Part of that means not to assume the genders involved in this situation. Whether it's the traffickers or other victims, we know trafficking can take many forms, and we don't want to make assumptions that could easily dissuade or put off our clients. You want to use phrases that are free of assumptions or judgments. An easy way to think of this is to avoid the why questions, such as, why did you do this, or why didn't you do that? Because as you're asking those questions, they could easily convey a sense of judgment that you do not intend. Lastly, you want to make sure that you are mindful of how you approach a child, from the way you position yourself physically in the conversation, to the environment of the room you're in, even to how you're approaching the conversation about trafficking. It takes a long time to build trust, and that's not something that you want to rush through. You want to avoid causing the client to shut down if at all possible, and you want to make sure they know that you are there for them. Next, I have the honor of introducing Gigi Green. Gigi Green is a 3L student here at the FSU College of Law. She not only serves in the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Law Project, but she's also served in the Children's Advocacy Clinic. Gigi has a passion for public interest, specifically in the area of human trafficking.
Thank you, Daynica. Hi, everyone. As Daynica just said, my name is Gigi, and I'm here to talk to you about victim impact statements, the Victim Compensation Fund, and expungements. So we're going to start with victim impact statements. As the name suggests, it's a statement given during a criminal proceeding against the trafficker to express the emotional, physical, and financial impact that the human trafficking survivor has suffered as a direct result of being trafficked. It can be written or orally presented during sentencing, but the benefit of giving an oral statement during sentencing is that it allows the judge to put a face and a voice to the survivor, which I think makes the survivor more personable to the judge. And as I said before, this is impactful when it comes to the sentencing, so that's really beneficial. Here is the Florida statute that speaks on the Florida Victim Impact Statement. And here is the corresponding federal statute. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the roles of the criminal attorney and the civil attorney. When it comes to a criminal trial, it's important to differentiate between the two roles of the civil and criminal attorney. Generally, the civil attorney has a more trusting relationship with the survivor since they spend more time with each other. And the survivor will benefit greatly if during the criminal trial, the civil attorney is present. Many of the survivors will be the main witnesses in the criminal prosecution of the traffickers, and it's very traumatizing for them to have to relive the abuse they have suffered. So the civil attorney's presence can help the survivor feel safer and more supported in telling his or her story at trial. Now I would like to talk to you about the Victim Compensation Fund. So the Victim Compensation Fund provides funds to human trafficking survivors who have an urgent need to escape from unsafe environments. I will say that the Victim Compensation Fund actually started out as funding for people who have been victims of domestic violence, but it's been extended to people who have survived human trafficking as well. And here is just a part of the form that you as an attorney would have to work with your client to fill out and return to the Office of the Attorney General. I'll talk more about it a little bit later, but you'll have to, click, well, not click it, but check this box right here showing that this is about human trafficking. And so it's really important to know that the money that the survivors receive from the Victim Compensation Fund cannot be just used for anything. There's a specific, how do I say this? The money can be used for specific things. And I listed some of the stuff here that it could be used for, like housing, emergency food or clothing, or utility deposit, transportation and whatnot. But it's important to remember that your client is going to have to keep the receipts for everything, because if the Office of the Attorney General wants the receipts and wants to see what the money has been used for, they're going to expect to have an itemized list. And if the money cannot be accounted for, the survivor may have to, come up with the money and return it. And we absolutely don't want that to happen, put even more stress. So make sure to keep the receipts. What I did for my client was I had her send me the receipts as she used the money so that I can approve it, look at it, and make sure that everything's okay and that it passed the requirements. Okay, and I wanted to talk to you about expungements. Second. So an expungement is the sealing of arrest and conviction records. This kind of expungement is more, I could say like expansive than the regular expungement, in the sense that, one second, sorry. In traditional expungements, you can only get rid of the convictions or seal your record from the convictions. However, in this kind of expungement, with the human trafficking expungement, you can seal the arrest and conviction records, which I'll explain to you why that's beneficial for your client later on. And I got this from the FDLE website that explains about the expungement. It allows a victim to petition for the expungement of record, with certain exceptions, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well, of any conviction, arrest, and the filing of charges for an offense committed while he or she was a victim of human trafficking. And I'll explain a little bit later how you can show that. So here are some of the requirements to get your record expunged in Florida. First, the survivor is going to have to petition the court for the expungement. And it doesn't matter which court the client petitions, as long as it's in the same circuit as where the offense occurred. The standard of proof is a preponderance of the evidence. The petition must be filed with due diligence, and I'll talk more about that momentarily, what due diligence means in this context. And the survivor needs official documentation. And when the survivor has this official documentation, it creates a presumption that the offense on the record was a result of human trafficking. Unfortunately, the statute is silent about what constitutes official documentation, but in our experience, we've seen documents from DCF, and we've used letters from the Rape Crisis Center, and that was sufficient proof to show that the survivor has undergone this. Additionally, the survivor will have to give a sworn statement saying that they are eligible for this kind of expungement. And if they have no additional documents, then the petitioner must prove eligibility by clear and convincing evidence. And then after all of this, a copy is served to the state attorney. So like I said before, I'll tell you some practitioner's tips about the human trafficking scheme. This is in the statute. Human trafficking scheme, the best way that we've, I guess, gone about figuring out whether or not the offending activity was in within the human trafficking scheme is to look at the beginning point of when the trafficking started and the end. And naturally, if you figure that out, things that happen in between, it's easier to prove that those things were a result of human trafficking if it's within that time period. The statute also references due diligence. There are no hard time requirements in the statute, but once a trafficking has ended or when the survivor has sought services, the courts are going to look at how long it takes the survivor to start the the process. So the sooner the better. Yeah. And then if you want more information, please review the Florida Rule of Criminal Procedure that I've listed down here, and it's going to tell you more about petitions and sealing and expunging. And so, like, what are the benefits of sealing and expunging a petition? It's to rectify society's mistake in charging survivors of child trafficking of crimes done in furtherance of criminal acts done for the trafficker's benefit. Again, these children were forced to perform these acts by their trafficker, and they really should not be punished for certain things that they have been forced to do. There are some exceptions that I'll get to in a little while, but that's the basic idea, the main idea. And it facilitates the resilience of the survivor in rebuilding his or her life, because if you don't have this on your back, if you don't have this record, it'll be easier for them to find jobs, it'll be easier for them to find housing, and it just makes life easier for them overall. And here I've listed a few of the exceptions. Some of the exceptions are murder, arson, kidnapping. The list is pretty long, so if you want a more exhaustive list of what is excluded, I put the statute right here, and there are a few of them, but definitely check that out. And the leading case for this is, for human trafficking expungement, is MG versus the state of Florida. And one of the most powerful excerpts from this opinion is as follows, and I put it here: persons who are victims of human trafficking and who have been convicted of crimes committed at the behest of their traffickers face barriers to life opportunities as long as these criminal convictions remain on their record. They should have the chance to rebuild their lives and re-enter society. So the goal is for survivors to have the opportunity to move forward in life. Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to introduce Melody. Melody is currently a 2L, and she's a president of the Non-Traditional Student Association. She's actually a double null who received her bachelor's at FSU undergrad. After undergrad, she took a 5-year hiatus, moved to LA to work as a sound engineer, which is really cool, and before returning to Tallahassee to attend law school. And so here is Melody.
Hi, everyone. So today I'd like to cover a few different topics. The first being safe houses, how trafficking works with the dependency system, some other advocacy goals, and finally, I'd like to talk about what success looks like. Okay. So this is the Florida statute regarding safe houses. There are 2 different types. The first is a safe foster home, which is a foster home certified by the department to care for sexually exploited children. The second is a safe house, and that's a group residential placement certified by the department to care for sexually exploited children. Okay. Safe houses and safe foster homes have to provide therapeutic environments tailored to the needs of commercial sexually exploited children. There are several requirements for safe houses. They must use strength-based and trauma-informed care. They serve exclusively one sex. They have 24-hour awake staff. They provide appropriate security. They not only provide trauma-informed trauma therapy, but also family counseling, behavioral health care, treatment and intervention for sexual assault, life skills and workforce training, among other things. Okay. The purpose of safe houses is to protect and conceal survivors. A lot of times children are, once they've been identified as survivors, they are placed in a safe house that is away from where they were. So a different part of the state, a different city, to create distance between the survivor and the trafficker. The Department of Children and Families contracts with the safe houses, and they are the portal to get access. Again, safe houses provide intensive trauma therapy and also other types of counseling and a safe environment. We've heard stories about survivors that when they get to the safe house, the people working there will hand them a towel and let them go take a shower in a safe environment for perhaps the first time in a long time, and as a symbol of washing off part of their own old life and following through in a new path. I'd also like to mention that currently only one safe house for boys is in Florida. So now I'd like to talk about the dependency system and how survivors interact. Victims of sexual abuse, as we discussed earlier, are at higher risk of human trafficking, and that is especially true for victims of sexual abuse that are already in the dependency system, and especially in group homes. It's important that all stakeholders create a case plan that addresses children's trauma. And trauma therapy needs to be advocated for survivors. We also wanted to mention equine and music therapy are additional resources, especially in cases where there are times where children survivors may not be opening up at first to specifically trauma therapy. And equine and music therapy are good resources to get children that have gone through trauma to find a safe, easy way to open up. Okay. Another part of the dependency system is that child survivors may have their own children. In fact, we believe that, in fact, every survivor that we work with at the clinic has their own child. In the case that DCF steps in and removes the child of the survivor is labeled as an offending parent, and they are not considered a ward of the state, even though they are a child survivor. For many, reuniting with their children is the motivator to begin rebuilding their life. This is a Florida statute that states that community children can also get access to safe houses. So a child does not need to be currently in the dependency system in order to gain access to the safe houses. Okay. Briefly, we'd like to talk about some other advocacy goals. A lot of times survivors will need access to Medicaid, and if they're under 18, they are eligible for Medicaid, as well as any children that they have. They may need assistance in healthcare, food assistance, food banks, housing, school. In the cases of international trafficking, they may need access getting their immigration documentation. They may need help gathering documents that may have been lost, escaping the trafficker. We've been working on birth certificates and IDs and social security cards to make sure that the survivors have these documents on their road to independence and wellness. We also wanted to give you guys a resource list in case you wanted to download our PowerPoint, so you would have easy, you could just click on everything and you could get to WIC, SNAP, birth certificates, and local food banks. Okay. This is an additional resource list that has some further reading if you feel like doing some more research. Okay. Finally, as Daynica was talking about earlier, you can become professionally certified in trauma and resilience. We wanted to give you guys a link to a human trafficking awareness poster that you could download and put in your offices so that if your clients see it, they would know the numbers to call in Florida and nationally. We'd also wanted to give you guys the link to the Trial Advocacy podcast, which is a podcast put together by the Help Clinic as well as the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. And it's a podcast about supporting survivors of human trafficking. And the link is there. There are currently 2 episodes with more on the way. If you're interested in international labor trafficking, Help also did a Valentine's Day cocoa and forced child labor video and that link is there below. All right. And now we'd like to talk about what does success look like. So the biggest thing that we should recognize is that success is not a straight line. Building trust with the survivor is one of the most important goals. And it takes a long time to build trust because of the trauma that the survivors are dealing with. As Daynica mentioned earlier, it does take a long time, and they may be hesitant when it comes to legal professionals. Moving forward looks different for every survivor, but every survivor needs support and a committed advocate. Okay. And what you can do, you can place the posters and flyers in your office. You can become trauma informed in your daily practice so that when you're interacting with clients that have dealt with trauma, that you're really making sure to communicate with them in a way that is trauma informed. Look for red flag vulnerabilities like sexual abuse and dependency cases, and prevent victimization by empowering children. Finally, we'd like to take a moment just to talk about what success has looked like with some of the clients. And I would say that any step forward, like a client asking about school resources, or they want to go back to school, because I think at that point they're looking towards the future, and they're finally able to take a moment and think about what happens next, rather than just what happens tonight, like we saw in the video earlier. I think we talked about how reunification with children is really a motivator for a lot of traffic survivers, and having that moment with reunification with children in the dependency system can really look like success as well. At this point, I'd like to ask Gigi to come back and talk about what success has looked like for her.
Thank you, Melody. So success to me, just like Melody said, is the survivor looking forward and trying to rebuild their lives and looking forward to a better future. Personally, one of the greatest moments that I thought was like a sign of success was when we got the victim compensation fund money for one of our clients. I won't lie to you, it was kind of difficult, and part of that was because of COVID. But having her get that money and having her do what she needed to do to actually get the money and just staying on board with everything was just very amazing and successful. It was so nice and gratifying to see her, you know, be able to spend that money in a way that was beneficial to her, you know. And another thing, a lot of our clients kind of fall off sometimes, and I think Daynica said that, but success is also keeping in contact with us and making sure that we have the information that we need to help them move forward.
Okay, well, thank you. At this time, I believe we want to open it up for questions and answers. I did see there was a number of questions in the chat. One question dealt with the certification of trauma, and maybe Daynica, since you're the certified one, if you could share that and your experience in getting that certification and how to go about it.
Absolutely. So the program is called the Professional Certification in Trauma and Resilience from the FSU College of Social Work. This, as mentioned, this is a professional certificate that's available for people outside of the FSU community, as well as current students at FSU. We have included a link to learn more about that certification in our PowerPoint slide, as well as I saw Christy mention that she'll send out more information in her email tomorrow. It's a great opportunity to learn the nuances of trauma, learn how to navigate that trauma and how to mitigate its manifestations.
And Daynica, is it an online certification process?
That is correct. It's online. So there are online modules that you go through.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you for sharing that. Gigi, I see there's a person asked a question, and there's a lot of questions. So I'm sure I'm missing folks. the person asked a question dealing with how long it took the process of actually getting the funds for the Victims' Compensation Fund.
That's a little bit difficult to answer, I will say, because of other factors. Prior to me joining the clinic, someone had already started the process, and I'm not exactly sure how long that took her. And on top of that, Corona kind of made things very difficult, and we kind of had to, I don't want to say be creative. It wasn't necessarily being creative, but that really slowed the process down a lot. So unfortunately, it took a couple months, but I think we have a stronger grasp on what we need to do. And if Corona wasn't in the way, I don't think it would take as long, definitely. But I'm sorry, I don't know exactly how long it should take.
Yeah, our experience, I'm sure like everyone in the audience, that 2020 was really just a different year. And it just took us almost everything we did. Every try to help, we try to do our clients. It just took us much longer. And we had to, I'm calling it creative. We had to come up with different ways of doing stuff. Just like one of the common things we always used to do was just pick up our client and bring them to the court or to the courthouse with our cars. And because of coronavirus, we weren't able to do that. So there was a lot of kind of workarounds that we had to do during 2020. And I'm sure everyone in the audience had to do the same. Christy, would you like to address some of the questions?
Well, and I just wanted to thank you all for all that information. We've gotten lots of compliments about all the work you're doing, the resources you've created. People are excited about the trauma-informed certificate. So I'll send that information out tomorrow along with the PowerPoint and the recording. COVID has made things interesting, but one of the upsides has been presentations like this, where we are getting to hear from you and learn about all the exciting things that are happening at FSU Law that we may not have known about. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. I did want to announce the CLE before I forget. The CLE number is 4557. Again, it's 4557, and I'll send that out tomorrow. And then we've got a couple questions that came in here. Someone was requesting if anyone has resources for music therapy in Central Florida. She said she's had trouble finding that. Do you all know of anything in the Central Florida area?
I do in my notes. So Christy, I'll get back with you and then maybe you can convey that information I have there. I do have a provider in Central Florida, I believe.
Perfect. And if anyone has follow-up questions or if we miss a question during this live webinar, you can just email me. I see that's from Barbara Glass. So hi, Barbara. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Barbara.
And someone had a comment about safe houses serving exclusively one sex might be a more ambiguous requirement in the age of transgender rights. So that's
really good point. And we don't have enough safe houses. That's all there is to it. Even if we accept there's only 378 children, there's not enough. We're not even close. So.
Okay. Oh, and someone posted about law students can join the public interest law section for $20. So that's exciting to get in on the ground level while you're still in law school.
And I do want to encourage students to do that. I think it's a great way for students to meet some of the leaders in public interest in the state of Florida from all around the state. And they can learn so much because the public interest section really has such a variety of public interest attorneys.
And we're all happy to help talk you into a career in public interest law. So you can reach out to any of us anytime. One of our participants said the international law section of the Florida Bar has a committee on international and human rights. So that might be a good place to spread the word about the work you're doing. Let's see, the chat box is not cooperating with me. Sorry guys, I'm still operating off my tiny little Surface screen, so I'm trying not to disconnect anything. From a legal perspective, what insight and feedback can you provide for child welfare agencies and court processes to best navigate and advocate for abused and neglected children who are actively involved in DCF cases? And
I could speak to that briefly.
Yeah, go ahead.
In my experience, I think it is so easy for these agencies to lose sight of the fact that these children who are going through this process, who've often had their child taken away, are still children themselves. And so anything that you can do in your advocacy to emphasize the fact and to seek adequate services in light of that fact is important. I know Professor Annino really went above and beyond to make sure our clients had access to trauma, specifically trafficking trauma therapies, and providing that assistance, because it is easy in the DCF process, in the dependency system, to lose sight of the fact that this is still a child client.
Mhm. Have you seen many objections by state attorneys to petitions for expungement?
You know, we're doing our first expungement right now. And so we'll let you know shortly.
Wish you the best with that. I hope it goes smoothly. And someone was asking how they can get a poster for their offices.
I think, Mel, did you send it in the chat? There's a link, and also in our resources.
Okay.
These are Department of Health of posters, and they're great posters. And these are the posters that are required now in doctors' offices, medical offices, and in massage parlors. And I think they can be used in a variety of places.
Okay, now I see the link to the poster. I didn't scroll down far enough, so thank you for that. That's important. Do you assist with immigration? I think you mentioned that you do assist with immigration work for your trafficking victims.
Yeah, so at FSU, at the FSU Law School, we have an immigration farm workers clinic. So we work together, and we usually refer our immigration cases to our immigration clinic. But we do special juvenile status petitions.
Okay, great.
And maybe a minute on labor trafficking. You know, the reason why a lot of immigrant children are vulnerable is because they're undocumented, and that's how they're exploited for labor trafficking. And in that field, I do want to give a plug to a documentary called Trafficking in America. Trafficking in America is a documentary, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It really brings home the trafficking that's happening in our society.
All right. This is a complicated question. Can the brain heal from ongoing trauma?
Daynica.
That is complicated. Because the neural pathways have been so deeply impacted, it is hard to say whether or not healing will look the same as it did as the brain looked prior to the trauma. I hope that makes sense. There is evidence of the ability to rewrite some of those neural pathways. There's evidence of progress that's made for people who have experienced that complex and long-term trauma that has impacted their neurological functioning. But to say healing per se, that's a difficult metric to evaluate. What I can say though is through the use of trauma intensive therapy, through the use and through the accompaniment of people who are informed about trauma, significant strides can be made. Professor Annino, do you have anything else you would like to add?
No, I think that, you know, I agree. I think what most neurologists will tell us is that, you know, it's when a platform is already created, it's going to take my understanding is it's going to take a couple of years at least before we actually see neurological improvements.
All right. We have a couple more questions if you don't mind hanging out for a few more minutes. Are safe foster homes limited? And I'm assuming foster homes in general are probably hard to come by. So do you have any?
Absolutely, very limited. And again, this is one of the major problems is because we don't have good data on how many trafficked kids we have in the state of Florida, we simply don't have enough services to provide them what these children need. We don't have enough safe houses. We don't have enough safe foster homes. We don't have on the panel enough psychiatrists and psychologists who specialize in trauma therapy in our communities. And so it becomes really difficult for the advocates out in the field trying to provide the services what their client needs and what these children need when they're simply having a hard time locating it.
Mhm.
And that's happening all around the state of Florida. And again, I think the problem is we're simply not funding it sufficiently.
Okay. Hopefully we can help get the word out that this is important and there's so much need. One last question. Are there special resources for internet types of trafficking, meaning taking pornographic images of victims and teens?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't address that type of trafficking, but just 2 weeks ago, or was it 3 weeks ago in Tallahassee, Florida, there was a trafficker in Australia who elicited 11 and 12-year-old girls in Tallahassee through a YouTube. He pretended to be a YouTube celebrity, which I don't know what a YouTube celebrity is, by the way. But he pretends to be a YouTube celebrity. And there were 258 young girls, a few in Tallahassee, but around the country, that were solicited by this trafficker, and were actually sending the trafficker pictures of themselves. So, and then trafficker was selling the pictures. So there's a variety of types of trafficking going on the web. And the main takeaway I would like to say on that is really just empowering your child, empowering children to be careful with the world.
That's good advice. Well, we got lots of compliments. Thank you for all this information. And I don't want to forget to thank the Public Interest Law section for co-sponsoring this.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
You've been wonderful partners with all this. And thank you, Professor Annino, Melody, Daynica, and Gigi. I wish you all the best in the rest of your law school careers. And please reach out to any of us. Like I said, we love talking about public interest, so you will not be bothering us at all.
Thank you.
Everybody,
Thank you.
take care.
Bye.